A friend asked me a question recently: who are better pilots, British or American? And at first it feels like quite a simple question. The UK has more exams, stricter procedures, tighter airspace. So I think people in the UK especially would think UK pilots must be better trained. But when you start digging into how much people actually fly, how accessible aviation is, and what training really looks like, you realise pretty quickly it isn't really a question about the pilots at all. It's a question about the system behind them. Hi, I'm Dale and this is Left Seat Culture, a channel about flying gear and the culture of aviation. Most of what I cover is general aviation, but hopefully it's of interest to all pilots, whatever it is that you fly. Now, just to be clear, this video is focused on general aviation. So we're talking about private pilots, PPL level flying, not airline or military training. I'll also say up front, I haven't personally flown in the US, so this isn't based on my own experience flying in the US or anywhere actually outside of the UK. Instead, this is based on research, data, and speaking to pilots who have flown in both systems. And actually, that gives us quite a useful perspective because we can step back and look at the bigger picture. So let's start with why people may assume that UK pilots might be better trained. If you go through training here in the UK under the Civil Aviation Authority system, things can feel pretty heavy. You've got 9 written exams. You've got obviously the structured radio phraseology in CAP 413, and you've got a very strong emphasis on airspace procedures and obviously doing things properly. And that's before you even get into any of the flying in the UK itself. Now compare that to the US system under the FAA. There's typically one main knowledge test, and then you do a check ride that combines both theory and the practical flying. So on paper, the UK system looks obviously more complex, and it's very easy to kind of make the leap from that to more exams must mean better pilots. But that's only looking at one part of this picture. Because when you look into how training actually works in the real world, the US has some pretty big advantages. The first one obviously being the cost. Training in the US is generally cheaper than here in the UK. Fuel is significantly cheaper. Aircraft rental tends to be also significantly cheaper. And overall, the cost of getting through the training can also be noticeably lower. The second advantage is speed. In the US, particularly in places like Florida, you've got far more flyable days than we have in the UK with our lovely British weather, which means typically a pilot can train almost constantly. You can fly multiple times in the week. And in some cases, people complete large parts of their training in a very short space of time. Whereas here in the UK, training is often more kind of stop and start. You might have weather delays, you might go for a couple of weeks without flying, sometimes even a month, and that obviously really breaks continuity, breaks down confidence as well. So while the UK system might feel like it has more structure, the US system often gets you flying faster and flying more consistently. And as with most things, the more you do it on a consistent basis, the better you might get at it. But obviously even that isn't really the full story, because one thing that comes up again and again from both pilots from both discussions online is that the US is only cheaper under certain conditions. If you go out there as a UK person and train intensively and complete your license quickly, then yes, it can work out cheaper. But obviously once you start adding in flights to get there, accommodation, food, time off work, and sometimes delays, then that can obviously narrow the gap quite a bit. So obviously that's more about obviously if a UK person went to the US or something. Obviously if you already live there, some of those costs won't be a factor. But there is one really important point that does come up repeatedly. You're often better off training in the actual environment you're going to fly in. So again, obviously if you're going to airlines, it might be slightly different, but for general aviation purposes, there's probably not much benefit for a UK person going to train for their PPO in the US and then coming back if you're flying here in the UK. And this is also where things get more interesting, because flying isn't just about passing a test. Flying, ultimately, it's a skill. And like any skill, it improves with repetition. There's a well-known aviation book called The Killing Zone, which looks at accident data in general aviation, specifically in the USA. And one of the key ideas is that it's not just about how long you train, it's also about how well you've actually done your training. But it also highlights something else. There's a period, often between 50 and 350 hours, where pilots are actually at higher risk because confidence increases faster than actual flying experience. So what you end up with is kind of a balance. Good training gives you the foundation. I don't think anyone can argue that. But real world flying is what builds judgment, and basically you need both of those. So when you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, the differences between the UK and the US are huge. In the US, there are thousands of public use airports. In the UK, there basically are far, far fewer. The pilot population in the US is also significantly higher, obviously because it's a much larger space. But more importantly, flying, in my opinion, is much more accessible in the US. And that's also what I hear from people who do fly in the US. In the US, fuel is cheaper, landing fees are often non-existent, and you generally don't need prior permission to land. Whereas here in the UK, the costs are unfortunately higher. Planning is more involved, and access to obviously airspace and airfields can be more restrictive. So flying in the UK often feels like something you plan very carefully, whereas in the US, it can feel much more like something you can just kind of go and do. And obviously there's some great aviation channels here on YouTube that demonstrate some of that in the US. And you can really see the impact of that when you talk to pilots who've experienced both systems. I had a message recently from a pilot who's flown in the US and Canada and is now working towards their UK PPL. And their experience really highlights the differences. They said the UK system feels much more theory heavy, but in North America, practical training includes things like full stalls, spiral dives, and upset recovery. And I think this is a really interesting way to look at it. In the UK, you're often taught to recognise and avoid the stall early, whereas in North America, you're more likely to explore it and then recover from it. Neither is necessarily better, but there is obviously just a slight difference in approach to how UK and US do their training. They also mentioned the aspects of navigation. Here in the UK, navigation is often easier because there are so many reference points, towns, roads and landmarks, where in parts of Canada where they're flown, it can be much more challenging because the terrain is much more sparse. But the biggest difference that they've highlighted was radio. In parts of Canada, they described doing flights of 2 to 3 hours without speaking to anyone, and I'm sure that's probably quite similar in the USA. Whereas here in the UK, you're almost always talking to someone, and that builds a completely different skill that we have here in the UK that may be less prominent in the USA. And when you look at wider discussions, whether that's Reddit, pilot forums, or older industry discussions, the same theme keeps coming up. The US is often described as cheaper and faster, but not necessarily better. And one piece of advice that comes up again and again is that you should train where it is you actually plan to fly. As I mentioned earlier, probably not much benefit in a UK person going to the USA to get their license quickly if then they're going to be flying in the UK all the time. Because if you train in one environment and then you move to another, you're probably going to need time to adapt. Different airspace, different radio styles, different expectations, essentially, based on where you're going to be flying. And that doesn't make one system better than the other. Obviously, there is differences. It just means that obviously the training and the process are designed for different environments. As I've already mentioned, there are some significant ones between the UK and the USA. So, to answer my friend's question, in my opinion, who are the better pilots? Is it British pilots or is it American pilots? And honestly, I think the answer is neither. Because whether you're a British pilot or American pilot, you are solving different problems. Here in the UK, the way that you'll learn and the way you fly tends to be more focused around structure, discipline and precision. Whereas in the US system, that tends to build pilots that have more experience, more confidence, and obviously just more volume of flying. And again, in my opinion, The best pilots are the ones that combine that both, because good training is what builds the foundation, obviously to make you a good or better pilot, but it's the experience of flying that helps build your judgment, which is why we say, obviously, once you get your license, that's when the real learning starts to happen. So, question to you, have you flown in both the UK and the US? Please share your experience below. I'd love to hear them. And if you found this video useful, give it a like and subscribe to Left Seat Culture for more GA insights and flying tips. And as usual, if you want to carry on the conversation, join our Discord. There's a link in the description. It's completely free and look forward to seeing you there. And if I'm really lucky, I'll see you next time in the next video. Till then, take care and goodbye for now.